Well, good evening, everyone. I am Reverend Sherri L. Jackson, based in Alexandria, Louisiana. And tonight we begin our 16th lesson of understanding the Old Testament, but it is the first lesson to the book of Exodus. And Exodus is the second book of our Old Testament. It is the second book of the Torah, the second book of the Pentateuch. Exodus is the sequel to Genesis. And one of the purposes of the book of Exodus is to continue the history of God's people. Exodus by itself cannot stand alone. It kind of like does not make sense if there was a Genesis. So for Exodus to make sense, there must be Genesis. It's almost like coming into the have and the have-nots in season 3, and you've missed season 1 and 2 because it all builds upon season 1. So just think about Genesis as being season 1 and Exodus season 2, and it continues the saga of the history of God's people. Now remember, when we started this lesson, these lessons, this journey, we said that the Bible is not the history of the world, but it is a history. It tells the story of God's people. The Old Testament tells the story of the relationship between God and Israel, basically, and the New Testament tells the history or the relationship between God and or it's the new covenant, which includes the Gentiles, which includes us. And if you will look in your Bibles, and hopefully you do have your Bibles, the very first word in the English version, which is our version, it says the first word for many of us should be the word now. It should be the word now. Now these are the names. Now remember, whenever we saw that phrase, now these are the names or these are the records of, it indicated that there was getting ready to be a shift or a change in the dynamics of the story which we have been dealing with. So every time God introduced a new saga or a new part of the story or a new character, there was always this phrase, now these are the names or these are the records of. And that's what we have starting with the book of Exodus. The English title is Exodus, and it is translated to mean exit, way out, or departure. The Exodus is the most historical and theological event of the Old Testament. Now, Abraham and his family, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, that whole storyline was all about getting us to the promise that God had given Abraham, that he would be the father of many. He was going to be the father of many nations. And we know that we started off this journey with Abraham and his wife Sarah trying to figure out how was this going to happen, because Abraham was 75 and he was as good as dead. He was basically impotent, and Sarah was barren. But God worked it out. And here, as we begin the book of Exodus, we have about 431 years of history in the book of Exodus. And so I found this little cute video, and hopefully everyone will be able to see it and hear it. And if at least it tells like real quick the story of Exodus. And I'm going to show it now. Guess I'm not going to show it now. That didn't work out too good, so we're going to move on to the next one. Okay, I will end up sending that video to you. I guess I'm not sure what happened. It told me I couldn't play it through this PowerPoint. But anyway, Exodus embraces about 431 years of history. It starts with the arrival of Jacob and his family in Egypt, because remember, at the end of Genesis, we had the family is reconciled. That's after the story of Joseph's brother putting him in the pit, and he ends up being in Potiphar's house. Has his Potiphar's wife basically tries to seduce him, but he gets away, ends up in prison, and all of that storyline. And at the end of Genesis, it says that Joseph died. And we suggested and indicated that that's a good pin to put right there, that when you have completed your purpose, then it's like there's nothing else for you to do. Joseph's purpose was to get his family to Egypt, and he did that. And when he did that, he died. And so the story picks up with Jacob's family getting to Egypt, and it goes all the way to the end where they will be erecting a tabernacle in the wilderness. Now you got to remember that right now they are still not a nation, so to speak. They are just a group of people, and by this time there are lots of people. They went in with about 70, and before you know it, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. And that is what got the Pharaoh really in an uproar, because now we got all of these people and they got to find something to do with them. So Moses is credited for being the author of Exodus. And the purpose of Exodus is, it is the story of God rescuing his people from slavery and forming them into a nation. Exodus focuses on the origin of God's people, and the book connects creation with redemption. Exodus is a salvation story. It is a pulling out of, it is a rescue book. And remember, that's what salvation is. God rescuing us from the penalty of sin, or God rescuing or saving us. And so Exodus is the Old Testament salvation story. Exodus is the deliverance of Israel out of Egypt, and it is equal to the resurrection story, or the resurrection of Christ in the New Testament, because remember, it is the resurrection of Christ, not so much that he died, but the fact that he was resurrected is our salvation story. And so in the Jewish tradition, the story of the Exodus is the big thing for them. They remember how God rescued them from Egypt. So what is the difference between Exodus and Genesis? Genesis began with all of humanity in view. Remember, in Genesis, we talked about God creating the heaven and earth, God creating humans. It was all about humanity as a whole. But when we get to Exodus, Exodus is going to focus on the Israelites. It is going to focus on Jacob's family, which is in essence Abraham's family. So God is working out his plan as scheduled. in Genesis, we basically focus on one man, which was Abraham and his family. But then when we get to Exodus, it's going to focus on Abraham's family, but it's going to tell this story through Moses. Moses is the central character in the book of Exodus. In fact, from here on out to the end of the Pentateuch, or the end of the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible, Moses is going to be the central character. And there are some similarities. We have Abraham, who had 2 siblings, Nahor and Haran, and Moses is going to have 2 siblings, Aaron and Miriam. Remember, Genesis, Abraham is called to leave his home and travel to a foreign land, and Moses is going to be forced to flee his home and travel to a foreign land. And if you've dealt with anything in the book of Exodus, you know what happened to Moses that caused him to flee. Are there any questions or comments at this time? Okay. So let's just kind of look at right now and outline how is the book of Exodus divided in. Now, the key to understanding any book in the Bible is to understand how the book is divided. The first thing in chapter 1 through 13, we will be dealing with God meeting Moses and then Israel exiting from Egypt. From chapters 1 through 13, that's going to be the central part of the chapter of Exodus. And then in the next portion, the rebels, Israel rebels. Israel rebels. You're going to see that in chapters 14 through 15. 14 through 15. In chapters 19 through 24, we will get the covenant laws and the commands. In chapters 35 through 40, we will have the tabernacle being built and God enters. No, I'm sorry, I went wrong. Covenant laws and commands then goes to the commands for building the tabernacle. God is going to give them the rules and regulations of how his house is to be built. In 32 through 34, you're going to see them rebelling again. And then 35 through 40, the tabernacle is going to be built, and then God is going to enter. So this is how we're going to approach the book of Exodus. And a lot of the things, the rules and regulations, we kind of like pass over because we say, oh, that's too hard of reading. But once we understand the laws that God gave, particularly about the tabernacle, we will begin to see why our churches are set up the way that they are, why they have the altar, why is the pulpit raised. All of these things have their origins in these scriptures. Now, depending on what church you go to, there may be some differences and variances and denominational wise, but there are some similarities. So the 3 key elements of Exodus. The great hero Moses. Moses is going to be, again, the central character. And remember, we've said this before, you've probably heard it. Moses spent 40 years thinking he was somebody, 40 years learning he was nobody, and 40 years discovering what God can do with a nobody. And so we're going to look at these three sets of 40. And when you can understand what happened during which period of 40 years, then you really have the story of Moses and basically the rest of the Pentateuch, or the rest of the law books. Another key element is the law. The moral law is given, followed by the ceremonial law, which was in part provision for the violator of the moral law. Now, people always have this discussion about what laws should we follow. We should follow all the laws of the Old Testament or all the laws of the Bible. Well, there are some laws that were given specifically for Israel, and those are called ceremonial laws. We don't follow ceremonial laws because ceremonial laws were basically laws about sacrifices, laws about how to enter into the tabernacle, all these things. But those kind of laws pointed to Jesus. We don't have to do those things because we already have Jesus. Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice. So when you hear people say, oh, well, you got to, if you're going to follow one, you got to follow them all. Well, it's very hard to follow ceremonial law in the 21st century. And those laws, as I said, were given specifically for Israel. But we have the ultimate sacrifice, so therefore we won't have to do those. Christ has taken care of all of that for us. And then the third thing that's a major element in the book of Exodus is the tabernacle, the beginning of worship and God's dwelling place. Now you have to remember that coming along with the people who will become known as the Israelites, when they start moving out of Egypt, there were other people who came along with them. They still had a mindset of worshiping and having all kinds of gods. There was the sun god, the moon god, the cow god, the animal god, all kinds of gods. And so God will begin shaping them to understand how to worship him, and also how to act in the dwelling place, how to act in the tabernacle, how to act in the sanctuary. So, where does this take place? As you can see, Egypt is in what continent? It is in the continent of Africa. Now, for those people who want to say that the Bible or Christianity has nothing for black, well, that's not necessarily true. This whole thing started on the continent of Africa, Egypt. This is where Moses will end up having to lead the people out of. And it is, of course, in the north around the Mediterranean Sea. And you can also see the Red Sea, which is going to be a very pivotal, important part of this whole Exodus story. And so Also, when studying the Bible, it is very important to understand the geography. Always make sure that you have a good Bible atlas, a good Bible dictionary, encyclopedia, because you need to know the lay of the land. One of the things when I traveled to Israel was seeing the landscape, the mountains. You know, when we read the scripture, Jesus said, you know, we're going to go to the other side, or let us go over to. Well, it wasn't just a hop, skip, and a jump. I mean, there were mountains and rugged desert area, wilderness area that they had to go. And so being able to see that, being able to see the Sea of Galilee and understanding where the mountainside, where Jesus taught the Matthew 5-7, the Sermon on the Mount. It is so important to understand the geography. So when studying the Bible, you can't just say, well, all I'm going to have is the Bible. That's all I need. Well, to understand the Bible, you're going to have other material, other resources. Okay, so again, this is another map that shows this whole where Moses started out at, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more. But when he flees, when he kills that man, he has to flee over to Midian. Now that's a long way from where he started out at. And so we're going to talk about this a little bit more when we get to it. So here's Egypt over here, but he has to come down. He ends up at Midian. Any questions, any comments? Are we together tonight? Okay. Okay.
Am I in?
Yes, sir.
Okay, well, thanks for sharing this with us. But one of the great things to look at, as you pointed out earlier, Exodus mean the way out. As we study this book and look at this family, Abraham's family, his descendants, after 400 plus years in Egypt, and how through struggle they multiplied, they grew, and we run into Pharaoh's family planning program. But just aside for us is to remember that Exodus have more miracles in it, not counting the 10 plagues. There are 18 really supernatural acts in the book of Exodus that had more miracles than any one book in the Bible. And as we unfold this book and see how God is working in the life of ordinary people, if we could just pin that to our hearts, that Moses was not superhuman. He was a man who grew up as a foster child in Pharaoh's house, but his parent taught him his heritage, and he knew who he was. But then here's also a murderer who killed somebody and tried to cover up his deed, and then one who was a fugitive for 40 years. And yet after 80 years old, foster child, fugitive, and now God is elevating him to lead his people. And when we study this book and see these miracles, see the human element unfold, I think our faith will become much stronger as we spend this time together studying this word. And I really appreciate you sharing the map with us, because if we understand the geography and the lay of the land and the customs and traditions of that day, it makes so much sense. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much for that. Is it Is there anyone else who would like to add anything, any questions, anything up until this point? Okay. So what's up with Egypt? Since Genesis 50, when it closed, it wasn't like the next day that all of this started to happen in Egypt. 350 years have passed since Genesis 50. Abraham's great grandsons gained great favor because of their brother Joseph being in Egypt. Only 70 people went down into Egypt, but 3 million people left Egypt. So you can imagine why the Egyptians and the pharaohs were kind of like up in arms because of all of these people being there. Joseph and some brothers died, and a new dynasty rules who didn't care about Joseph's legacy. The new king saw the wealth and great numbers of children of Israel and became suspicious, and he decided to break them by reducing them to slavery. There were going to be hard taskmasters over them. And this is one of the stories that particularly African Americans became attached to, because it seemed to align itself with the story of slavery that blacks faced here in America. So it was one that they could really catch hold to. So when we look at chapter 1 of Exodus 1 through 7, it's kind of like a review, kind of like reviewing some names of some names that we are already familiar with. So let's just kind of like look at Exodus 1 through 7. And it tells us basically that 70 people came. There were 70 people, but Joseph was already in Egypt. Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation. But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. And again in verse 8, there's that word again. Now a new king arose over Egypt. So this is good. This is helping us as a transition to understand that we're going to shift into another storyline. So it says that the king of Egypt did not know Joseph. It is not that he did not know him, but he did not want to acknowledge the favor and the legacy that Joseph had. So it was almost like he was trying to dismiss him. He said to his people, behold, the people of the sons of Israel are come more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply in the event of war, and they will also join themselves to those who hate us. So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor. And so, it backfired on them, because it seems that the more that they inflicted on them, the more they it went against them. They just kept multiplying. And then when we get to 15, it says, then the king of Egypt spoke to Hebrew midwives. So now we introducing another storyline where the first plan didn't work. Plan A did not work, which was to make them work hard, be hard taskmasters over them. So when we get to verse 15 in chapter 1, the Pharaoh has a plan B. And that plan was to ask the Hebrew midwives. One of them was named Shiphrah and the other was Puah. And he said, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it's a daughter, you shall let her live, basically. So it's interesting that the Egyptians he didn't choose an Egyptian midwives to do this, but he chose some Hebrew women to do this. And perhaps he was already factoring in that some of the boys were going to get away. If it had been the Egyptian women, they would have followed the rule all the way. But these women did not. Now, if you understand, he said, get rid of the boys. I'm wondering why, and I offer this question up to you tonight. Why would he say, get rid of the baby boys? Why would he?
Well, it's a pretty plain answer. Pharaoh's family planning program is that if there are no male men around, there'll be no babies. If we just have females, there won't be any babies. The men are gone. America's family planning program is really the jail system, the prison system. When we see who's locked up, 80% of the population are the young males. And you look at it without even saying it. You plan the country, war takes off males. You kill a certain number of males with war. You kill a lot of males with disease and famine, and then you throw in the prison system. And we kind of like Pharaoh. We getting rid of the boys. And if you get rid of the boys, you control the population.
Yes, getting rid of the baby boys. If he could get rid of the boys, then he could change the identity of the nation. Latanya, did you have your hand raised? Latanya?
Yeah, I did, but it was only because you went mute for a really long time, and so did Pastor Green, and I wasn't sure what that was about. But that's okay. I'm good now.
Okay. So if he could get rid of the boys, as Pastor Green said, then he could change the identity of the nation. Now, because back then the bloodline or the identity came through the male, but ironically today in Judaism, the identity, you trace your lineage through the mother. When I was in Israel, they said that anybody who has who could trace their lineage through their mother, who could prove that their mother was a Jew, so to speak, that they could come back to Israel and live. Because they have it open where they want everybody, all the Jews, to return to the homeland, and so they trace it through the mother. Well, that wasn't the case back in this time of Exodus. They traced the line through the male. So Pharaoh said, okay, when the midwives see that a male or a boy was coming through, then they were to get rid of it. But he did not count on them being God-fearing women who disobeyed. And what they basically told them is that, these Hebrew women, they strong before they could even get there, that the baby, the baby is there. And so this was civil disobedience. They were not following the law as written. Now, remember a couple of weeks ago, we had this big thing in our news about civil disobedience where the clerk of court from Kentucky was disobeying the law based upon her religious preference or her religious beliefs. And that was civil disobedience. Did she have the right to do that? Yes, she did. She did have the right to disobey, but also deal with the consequences. And this is what happened with these women. They were putting their lives in danger by going against the Pharaoh. So his first plan didn't work, which was to, if we can just work them hard enough, then, we can get rid of them. That didn't work. Then he changed to, okay, well, we will just put the midwives, when they see the boys, they will get rid of the boys. Well, that didn't work. They might have gotten rid of some of them, but they did not get rid of all of them. And so these women were courageous women at a time when they certainly could have been killed or certainly hurt for disobeying the Pharaoh. But they were God-fearing and they went with their conscience rather than the law. So they were called to deliver, to save, and to help. And God rewarded them by making them matriarchs of great families. And so the third plan was, okay, this is not working. So what we're going to do is, since the babies are coming, the boys are coming, then we're going to put them in the water. We're going to drown them. And so then we get to chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, where we are introduced to Moses, the birth of Moses. Are we together, everybody straight? Any questions? By the way, if you have a question and you do not want to ask it openly, there is a chat feature that you can ask a question, and I can see the question through chat, or you can raise your hand and I'll see it and call on you. So we get to chapter 2, verses 1. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no more, she got him in a wicker basket and covered it with tar and pitch. Now, there was an instance, and this is an open question, there was an instance in the Old Testament where another family was saved by being covered in a shelter, or they were saved from the water by even though they were in water, but they were saved. What family would that have been? In the Old Testament, in Genesis, where was another time where there was somebody who was saved from had to end up in water, but they were saved from that water. They were covered.
Well, you might think of Noah in that sense.
Yes,
but
I'm thinking of Noah.
Told him how to build the boat before there was water or rain, and he built it as he was instructed, and he saved his family and started the human race the second time.
That's right. And
he was a good preacher of righteousness.
Thank you. What I'm trying to suggest is water is going to be a very important element in our study. Water is always used as a cleansing, as a saving, as a purifying agent. So again, Moses is going to be, his parent is going to put him in a basket and cover him and put him in water. So again, a basket or ark-like situation is going to keep him safe. So when studying, remember that there are certain things that continue on. That there's kind of like, once you know, can really start thinking about, well, where I've heard this before. Is God saying the same thing in this instance that he said before? So just think about those things. Try to keep in mind the continuity of when you're reading and when you're studying. So his family put him in a basket in the water, and so in so many words, they are still doing what Pharaoh suggested, put him in the water, but certainly not in the same way that he was asking for. And so we know the story of Pharaoh's daughter coming down to bathe at the Nile with her ladies, and she saw the basket and she sent her maid and brought it to her. Now, Moses' name in Hebrew means to draw out. Now, isn't that because he was drawn out of water? So Exodus means to draw out, and also Moses' name means to draw out. So when we get to 11 through 14, we see that Moses is in his second 40 years. So his first 40 years, he is in a preparation mode. He is being nurtured and trained in the Pharaoh's house. Now, again, this is just a side. Moses, even though God had purpose for Moses, he didn't just put him out there. He was in a preparation period. How many times we, get this call, we figure we know what we should be doing, but we don't want to be trained. We don't want to go through the process of being trained, being nurtured, sitting under somebody in order to learn before going out. So in Moses' first 40 years, he was in a preparation mode. And then in his second 40 years, he gets in trouble. Again, there's that word now. Now it came about in those days when Moses has grown up, that he went out to his brother and looked on their hard labors, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brothers. So he looked this way and that, and when he saw there was no one around, he struck the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He went out the next day, and behold, two Hebrews were fighting with each other, and he said to the offender, "Why are you striking your companion?" But he said, "Who made you prince over or a judge over us? Are you intending to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and said, "Surely the matter has become known." When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian, and he sat down by the well. So Moses is up in Egypt. He sees his kinfolk, there's a fight. He ends up murdering an Egyptian man. And then he ends up fleeing over to Midian. So he comes from Egypt. He ends up in Midian. to get away, where he spends another 40 years, and then God ends up sending him back to get the people. Now, how many times you mean to tell me that God will use Moses, a murderer, to do such an important job of getting his people out? How many times have we disqualified somebody because we determined that they could not do it because of their sins, or because of their faults, because of their habits, because of whatever? But God yet chose Moses, who had a rap sheet. He wasn't a thief. He was a murderer. He had taken somebody's life. But Midian is where Moses spent 40 years. And it was 40 years between the time he fled Egypt after killing an Egyptian who had been beating a Hebrew and his return to Egypt. 40 years. Now this here gives me hope that God can use me. And I'm thinking that perhaps it gives you hope too, that God can use us in spite of us, in spite of our faults, in spite of our wrong. God still has purpose. And so throughout all of these lessons, one of the big things that I always try to share is that, as Pastor Green alluded to earlier, these biblical characters were not superheroes. They were ordinary people who God chose to use. God uses ordinary people, and I'm glad of that. So Moses' initial failure is he is a murderer. But who gives him his authority? God gives him his authority. And so when we look at this story of Moses, we see that he is going to be a pivotal part in this whole thing of moving God's people. And remember, it's not just about these Israelites. At the end of the day, it's about Christ and eventually about us. Now, I also want you to take, when you see that word well, Moses at the well, we read that about he ended up in Midian and sat down by a well. Now, in this time, in this biblical period what we're talking about, wells, that was in the center. That's where a lot of business transactions was taking place at. That's where a lot of business was taken care of, at the well. So we're going to see, and we have seen in our previous study, that there were some other encounters at the well. Hagar, remember Hagar, which was Abraham's servant, that he ended up having a child for because he and Sarah didn't want to wait for God to move. And so Hagar encountered God at the well. Jacob meets Rachel at the well, and Abraham meets Rebecca at the well. So as we continue to take this journey, remember that well is going to be an important place. Pastor Green.
Well, the well or watering hole, people did not have running water like we have now. And so it was appointed primarily to women who would go to the well, draw water from an open system type well, water the animals, then bring water back to the house for household goods. And it was no coincidence that where there is fresh water in supply, people will gather. And many times in traveling in Africa, one of the greatest things they have is a water well where people can go back and forth to bring water rather than get it from a creek in some of the outlying areas. My prayer for us is, as you pointed out, as we look at this word, let's let the word talk. Let the word on top of the line speak to us. And as the word speaks to us, it's going to become very, very plain that God used people who are open to God. So if a person is open to God, whatever the past was, it is the past. God used us in the present and in the future. So Moses readjusted. Now he's 80 years old and finally receives a call. But the funny part with this story is you unfolding. God said to Moses, I have come down to deliver my children, but I'm sending you to Pharaoh. So sometimes when God has a plan, he sends some of us. And sometimes some of us don't want to go.
Certainly. Like you said, whales were precious commodities, and it was the females who were going to be out there drawing the water, and it was hard work. Whales is an image for life. So remember, water equals life, and so whenever you see whale, it is an image of life. Because whales were scarce, people congregated and made social contact. This is a typical scene where a traveling male meets his future wife was at the well. It wasn't on christianmingle.com, or it wasn't at the coffee shop or anything like it, or the bookstore, the school. It was at the well. Some wells became so prominent that even at the time of Jesus, the name remained like Jacob's well. And Moses, as we continue with this story, will find 7 daughters of the local priest being harassed by the shepherds at the well. He rescues them and draws water for them. So when you see the well, W-E-L-L, it is a picture of life. It is a picture of activity. It is a picture of where business transactions were taking place at. And so once you have that concept, when you see that where somebody met, even when we get to the New Testament, when Jesus meets the woman at the well, it's the same kind of scenario. So Moses has come to, when we get to 15 through 22, Moses ends up staying in Midian. This is the time where God shapes him, works on him. It's a time where his character is developed. It's a fresh start for him. And he's going to be seen as a deliverer. It's going to be the first time we see him as a deliverer when he ends up rescuing those daughters from the shepherds who were harassing them. Yes, sir. Okay. So this is, I'm going to stop here tonight because this gives us a good pitch before we get into chapter 3, because we're going to spend a little time there. But I wanted to just give us a good picture of where this story is going. And so if you were with us in Genesis, you can see the continuation of this storyline that it is continuing. It is still the story of Abraham's children. It is still the story of God's promise to Abraham. Okay?